Okay, great. So we're recording. Yeah, motion building workshop. I'm just going to sort of walk you through the process, my thought process, how I build a case, and hopefully you can apply principles in it as well. Okay, so the first motion I've chosen is, I think I would say a semi-generic social movements motion, but also not that generic, in that it's sort of a clash between, like, okay, let's work through the motion and find out what the clash is. So motions that are the most straightforward are motions that says we should do X over Y, because then the burdens are very obvious. The burden on Garth is to say we should do X over Y, and the burden on Op is to say we should do Y over X. And the best debates happen when teams do not try to screw around the burdens and actually debate the motion properly. So in this motion, this house believes that social movements should focus on publicly shaming corporations to change business practices rather than to achieve those outcomes through legislative change, legislative action. The Gulf burden is just to say that they should focus on public shaming over legislation. And the Op burden is to say we should do legislation over public shaming. It's just very simple, just like that. So that's the first thing that you need to identify when you use prep motions. Is what's the burden of proof that you need to discharge. The way to identify your burden is to try to reduce the motion to its central question, right? So in this particular debate, or if you're sort of confused about what the debate is about, for example, an emotion about collective unconscious, where you have no idea what is happening, the way to sort of break things down and identify the context, and then start generating ideas from there, is to sort of break down the words in the motion and to identify the problems essentially that the debate wants you to achieve and stuff. So with regards to breaking down the words in the motion, I think keywords, we have social movements, right? Obviously we have public shaming, which is the action word, and then we have legislative change, which is the second thing. So social movements are basically broad-based movements that attempt to fight for social change, largely decentralized, all that stuff. So aside from just like getting the central question of the debate, which in this case I think is relatively obvious, what breaking down the words of the motion can do is to also help you identify key characterization and context about what the debate's about. So it's very important because like people have this tendency of saying, oh, we should do this because this is good, but not really fleshing out what this looks like. So in this case, trying to say that social movements should attempt to boycott and shame corporations because this is a good thing, because corporations are bad. And just like the logic is not wrong, but that sentence just sounds very generic and sounds very debatey and just not very persuasive in general. The way to make the argument sound realistic and to make it sound persuasive is to use context and characterization. So in this case here, fight for social change is generic. Context here would be things like feminism, right? Pushing for abortion rights / legalization. This could look like the environmental movement or the green movement, right? Pushing for carbon tax. So this grants some realism into what we are talking about in this debate, and makes it also, like, when it comes to contextualizing and grounding the impacts, it only really makes sense in the context in which you argue those things. And later on a bit, we're going to look at how there are some contexts that are more strategic for you to argue things in as opposed to others, which is why choosing that characterization is also really important. Social movements, they largely are decentralized, but you also have some centralized movements. So things like leader movements, like I don't know, civil rights movement, I guess, in the past, that was led by MLK. These are movements that sort of group around a single icon or a single leader, as opposed to a decentralized movement like feminism that has very many diverse groups and many different schools of thought. So you have cultural feminism, for example. You have the very controversial TERFs. So that TERF stands for trans exclusionary radical feminism. the broad consensus now is that TERFs should not be part of feminism. That is something that is inherently exclusionary and stuff. But the point is that because it is a relatively decentralized movement, that's why you have different schools of thought and different groups inside the movement. Yep. Okay, cool. Obviously, we can go on doing this forever, but usually 1 or 2 lines is enough. And if you have questions or you don't know how to proceed further, then you can continue doing that. But I'm just going to leave it here first. Okay, let's move on then to public shaming. So what this looks like probably is calling companies out on social media. So this looks like I should have prepped examples for this. But basically, you have people that report the news articles, like whistleblowers that basically shame corporations for not doing things that they promised to do. So, for instance, when H&M promised to, when H&M basically shifted their factory to the third world, and then there was a big controversy about the chemicals that they were dumping into the waters, and also the labor rights that they were using. And what happens when those things went public was that H&M had to sort of recall their things and say, oh, well, we will be better. I'm so sorry about it. The other example that just comes to my mind now is Nike. So there was this sports athlete that Nike wanted to sponsor as their mascot. It was a woman of color. I can't remember her name, but basically Nike didn't fulfill their end of the contract, and then the lady called them out, and went to another sports company to be their leader. Yeah, okay, I really should have prepped this beforehand, right? Okay, never mind. The point here is that this is what public shaming looks like, and this is what it can achieve. Yep, whistleblowers, etc. And outcome is companies hopefully change behavior to protect reputation. Right. The final thing, or the final moving part in this motion is this: what is legislative change? I think this looks like grassroots campaigning and lobbying. Awareness campaigns are included inside here. This looks like lobbying politicians, right? Lobbying politicians, getting law/policies passed, right? So examples of this include sexual harassment policies, or anti-sexual harassment rather. Policies passed. There's this very notable law in the US that says that you cannot be fired from your job on the basis of your gender, on the basis of your sexual orientation, or I can't remember the criteria exactly, but that law was crafted specifically to prevent companies from firing women that were sexually harassed by their bosses, and then now were being threatened with getting fired if they didn't keep quiet about things that will happen. But there was an example of a policy that was passed: prevent employers from firing victims of harassment. The reason why this is important is because, okay, so if you've been harassed at your workplace, I don't think you want to stay there and work for a long time. But the difference between being fired for cause and being fired without cause is that if a company has to let you go without having a justifiable reason for it, they have to give you a benefit package when you leave. So it's like, for example, if you get retrenched and the company doesn't have capacity to continue paying your salary, they need to let you go with 3 months salary plus health bonuses for 3 to 6 months or something like that. Comparatively, if you are fired for cause, that means you don't meet KPI, or you are actively caught doing things that hurt the company's image, or stealing from the accounts or something like that. That means there's cost for the company to fire you, and that allows the company to get rid of you without needing to pay any benefits. So that is an example as to how victims of sexual harassment potentially are screwed over, and policies created specifically to prevent that. Victims of harassment without cause, or like for frivolous cause rather. This protection of victims, please get severance package. Okay, so after you have done all these characterization things, and in this motion, I think that the central question is quite obvious. It is whether movements should do X or Y. That's it. And the burden on Gov is just to say we should do X over Y, and obviously converse burden opposition to do the other thing. I just want to point out that there's this temptation sometimes if you're an opposition team or motion like this to say things like, oh, instead of doing Y over X, we'll instead propose doing Z. And like, so let's say in the motion, this house that in this the motion here, social movements should publicly shame corporation as opposed to achieving legislative action. And then PM goes up and says, here's all the reasons why public shaming is so impactful and so beneficial. And then Op goes up and says, oh, we oppose public shaming, but the counterfactual we support is not legislative action. It is, I don't know, doing nothing, or like underground assassination of corporate leaders, like whatever they want to support. That's just not allowed. There was some controversy about this particular rules that I don't know what majors they made the rule, where if the motion says X over Y, opposition must defend Y over X. And if you do some weird things, then you just automatically lose the debate. The other thing that sometimes happens is Op says, we can do X and Y, right? So we can shame them and we can support legislative action. So you sort of get the best of both worlds. So I think that if you've been debating for a while, there are a lot of reasons as to why that case is just soft and not defending the burden that's required for them to defend. But I just want to point here that that's very unstrategic, because if you accept we should do X and Y, that means that there's some value to doing X. And if you accept that there's some value doing X, it's very difficult for you to argue that we should do Y as more important than X. So just directly do the way of Y over X, just make life easy for everyone, have a proper debate. Okay, so that's the first thing in terms of burden identification. What's the central question in debate? Once you identify that, the arguments that you run must discharge this particular burden, which attempts to show that public shaming is the way to go for social movements. On opposition, you need to show that legislative action is the better way and more accurate way of going about it. So before going into like sort of the building of argumentation and stuff, at this point, I think it is strategic. As in, if you can't do this, this is a more higher level technique. But if you can't do this, that's fine. You can move to building the arguments first. But if you can see it, then it's more strategic at this point to sort of look ahead in the round and sort of look at what teams are going to attempt to prove. Because what Gov is going to attempt to prove here is to say that public shaming is the best course of action for social movements, right? And opposition is going to say, but actually the better course of action to push for legislative change. And if you ask yourself, what is the outcome of this and why should social movements prioritize one over the other? You realize that both of these actions are mechanisms that attempt to achieve social change or attempt to protect victims or the oppressed in society. So the question in this round, in terms of what social movements should prioritize, then needs to be compared here, because both sides, at least assuming both sides, prove the mechanism properly, both sides will have some efficacy with regards to achieving change and protecting people on the ground. The question is what sort of change is preferable, and here's where the weighing metrics, the comparison comes into play here, and being aware of those weighing metrics and being just being aware of those weighing metrics will help you craft the argument in a way that proves that particular weighing metric. So you don't waste time talking about things that either uncontentious or not helpful to your case. You can directly focus on things that would help you. So with regards to the comparison of shaming vs legislative change, why why is the change achieved through shaming more impactful than focusing on legislative change? So all social movements debates, these arguments just sort of repeat themselves and stuff. I've done a lot of them, that's why I can just, come to me and stuff. But if you don't know, if you're not familiar with these metrics, well, you will be after this. But the way to be aware of those things is to read more. Read up The Economist, open up Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera and New York Times are very good for catching up on news and analysis around the world. The Economist is good as well, but if you don't have a subscription, it's a bit difficult. Actually, to be fair, New York Times still needs a subscription, so Al Jazeera is still the best way to go. If you don't like reading, you can watch infographics and documentaries on YouTube. There's a lot of them out there. Something actually quite interesting. So that's how to build awareness and knowledge about how the world is like. Anyways, coming back to this, why is shaming better than legislative change? I will point out firstly that the first metric that comes to me is in terms of time frame, right? Because shaming is more of an immediate reaction. You make a post today, company reacts tomorrow within like 24 to 48 hours because they need to protect the reputation and all these things. Whereas pushing for legislation is a process that can take anything from months to years, because getting enough, like just drafting that policy alone takes like months. After that, you need to go out, campaign, get popular support. After that, you need to go push it, get politicians. Please support this thing. It's very important to your constituency. And like after all of that process happens on the back end, you then need to go to Parliament. You need to debate that policy, debate that bill, get it done. It could even get rejected, especially if the Parliament consists of a lot of people with various political incentives and stuff. So the point here is that it just takes a very long time. So shaming is faster than pushing legislation. So that's the first thing. And the direct outcome or the direct impact of this is that you protect people faster, get more, what's that? Get more change out, basically. Okay. The second point of comparison that comes to me, that I can think of rather, is in terms of sustainability. So one thing about publicly shaming corporations is that it's quite bad for them. And like, I think just intuitively, most people don't like to be publicly shamed on social media. So I think that shaming corporations is likely to generate a degree of backlash that is likely to, in some shape or form, hurt the capital of your movement to push for change in the future. So this can look like, if it's true that companies are quite popular and are supported by people, then attacking those people is likely to lose you support as the movement. So easy example of this, J.K. Rowling. A lot of people really love Harry Potter in the series. So when she came out as a turf and stuff, yes, the views are not necessarily the best, but directly attacking and shaming J.K. Rowling online necessarily meant that you were going to lose the support of people that liked Harry Potter but didn't really care about feminism in general. And that's why the movement was likely to lose capital. So we can put here, shaming leads to loss of capital. There's an impact here, is that long-term change jeopardized because you get less capital to pass change in the future, assuming these things happen now. The third metric that I can see is reversibility, right? I guess it's sort of related to sustainability. This is more of a long-term aspect. Reversibility is in terms of reversibility. So if you shame a corporation into changing their behavior, then they could change their behavior in the best case. But there's no guarantee that they will continue a sustained path towards change, because the only incentive for them to change is a negative reinforcement mechanism, right? So what this can manifest in is either corporations making a change now and then, reversing that change a bit later. Or second, and more perniciously, to just bring the harm somewhere else, somewhere where it's harder to see, harder to call out, harder to hold them accountable for. So basically, this means what this looks like, for example, is H&M being called out for having bad labor practices in Africa. What they did was that they just uprooted all the factories and they moved them towards Vietnam. So the problems were the exact same problems is there. It's just that it is in a different place. So it's out of sight, out of mind. People are not aware of it. So this means that you're not actually protecting people in the long term. What you're doing is that you're displacing the harm towards another place, sometimes in areas where it can be even harder to hold accountable. So reversibility is, shaming is, what's that? Company incentive, profit. So likely to only change for visual practices or like for optics, basically. And go back to inflicting harm and displace harm somewhere else. Okay, so we have 3 metrics over here already. There's, of course, a lot of other metrics you can use. I think in terms of time frame, this is probably where Gov is going to be ahead the most. And here's where probably you want to focus the bulk of the argumentation on Gov. In terms of sustainability, so there is a way to make the argument on Gov that change can be sustainable. But I think just on the surface level, it seems to be a metric that opposition will win by, which is what you want to preempt in Gov and then also try to win on those metrics. Yep. So a bunch of other metrics that I guess if we think a bit longer, we can think of, but I'll just move on to the next part here. Okay, so if you can see the strategy first before moving into the building of the argumentation, then it's more strategic because you can know what outcome or what impact you need to build the argument towards. If you can't do that, that's fine. You can just build the argument first and then tailor the argument to win the metrics later on, which is what we're going to do right now, is to mechanize the argument. Mechanize public shaming. How does it achieve outcome? Okay, so before going to the mechanization here, I just want to talk a bit about mechanization just from a meta perspective, because like it's important to note that debate is a game of persuasion. Like the truth matters less than the extent to which you can persuade someone to believe that your claims are true. So what this means is, if in order to convince the average reasonable person that X policy leads to Y outcome, you need to explain the process as to how this policy creates that particular outcome in order to convince the average reasonable person that the outcome you are talking about is true and is likely to materialize. And that's what mechanization looks like here. So for instance, like you can think of it like this. If you're a salesperson and you're trying to sell like I don't know, essential oils to someone, if you just say that essential oils will make you look more beautiful, then there's no reason for people to believe you unless you sort of go a little bit into the science as to how this interacts with your skin cells and your pigment to give you the inner glow that will make you irresistible towards the people around you and all that crap. So that's what mechanization is basically, is explaining the process of how this works. So I would just note here, if you go back up to the central question of whether you should do X or Y, you need to, on Gov, you need to mechanize X. So in this case, public shaming. How does public shaming achieve outcomes for social movement? Conversely, on opposition, you need to mechanize Y. You need to explain how legislative change is able to create positive impacts for social movements. And the first point of response that you want to have on either side as well is to directly attack the mechanization and to attack the process analysis. Because if you can disprove the fact that this policy on balance of likelihood does not lead to this outcome, then the comparison is no longer what form of change is better for social movements. The comparison is one side gets changed, the other side does not. And obviously the side that gets changed is going to be at a massive advantage in terms of persuading the judge to win. Yeah, so that's why mechanization is very important. Secondly, like there's a lot of things you can say to mechanize the argument, but what mechanisms and the explanation of process does is that it firstly grounds the likelihood of this outcome to be true. So is this outcome likely to materialize? That depends very directly on the strength of the mechanisms. But secondly, on the extent to which it affects people, right? So if you want to say that this policy affects or protects the most vulnerable people in society who are directly affected by these things and need immediate protection, it is the mechanisms that demonstrate how those vulnerable people are protected, which is necessary to show the extent of the benefit you achieve from government. So especially when both teams are semi-decent at mechanizing claims, the team with the better mechanisms usually weighs out in terms of the strength of the outcome. And that's one of the metrics you can use to weigh which side achieve better positive change. So yeah, okay, so let's do this. What does public shaming look like and how does it achieve the outcome? So we talked about here, just copy paste down here, calling companies out on social media. Right, e.g. H&M, e.g. Nike, e.g. Volvo. For those who are less aware, Volvo was basically outed for having an AI algorithm built into the car that attempted to reduce emissions produced to try to pass environmental regulation, and they were outed for it and they were fined like massively. They have tried to flout environmental regulations. Okay, so why is this effective or how does it work? It directly affects or rather tarnishes the reputation of companies, meaning cast them bad actors in society, right? Polluting, exploiting, exploitative, etc., etc. So the outcome of this then, people less likely to buy products like usually the biggest incentive to boycott a product is because it is directly going to hurt you. So for instance, if like pharmaceutical products have been shown to have a likelihood of causing side effects, then you may probably want to stop buying that particular supplement or drug just because you want to directly protect yourself. Yep, so this like protect self from bad/harmful products or protect self from exploitation, exploit. Yeah, okay. Whatever stuff, okay? So that's the first reason, the most effective way to boycott a company. The second is to sort of cater to the more woke groups in society, cater to progressive consumers, or like woke consumption, right? Where you want to consume ethical consumers, they call it. Purchase products from companies that won't engage in bad stuff. So that's another way in which companies lose demand. The third way is competition. So competitors step in to fill the demand gap, steal market share away from the offending company. So these are the mechanism. Actually, it's not outcome, it's the max. As to how public shaming creates the outcome. The outcome of this, firstly and most obviously, companies lose profit. Because people are not buying product. Okay. The second is that companies lose market share to competitors, all of which is bad for companies because incentive of companies is to maximize profit, right? Duty to shareholders, personal incentives, want to earn money. All these things mean that companies have an incentive to change their behavior for the better. So what happens as a result then? Companies likely to change behavior for the better. Right? This looks like making a public apology, putting out internal memos, slash statements, slash policies, rewriting company policy in order to prevent this harm from happening again. It can look like firing person, especially if this is like a leader that did something bad. So if it's a sexual harasser, it's someone that has a lot of allegations made against this person, the company may choose to let him go. It just doesn't matter whether the person is guilty or not. The fact that there is a reputational damage to the company just means that the best way for the company to recover is to just get rid of this person, get rid of the political baggage and stuff. Yep. The secondary outcome to this is in terms of deterrence, right? Companies, other companies in the future less likely to prioritize profits over, let's just say morals here, because scared of being called out. And any other outcomes that I missed here? Guess not. But I think that this is enough to prove that public shaming achieves the social movements, which is the impact. Social movements achieve intended outcome of reducing harm, right? Protecting members in their movements that they are obligated and created to protect, right? So this is basically, at this point, this is everything before here. Wait, did I just delete all the weighing mechanisms?
You cut the thing out and then you paste it on the end.
No, the weighing mechanism, the time frame, the sustainability and stuff. Ah, crap. Okay, I think I did. Right, technology, very nice. Right, comparison metrics, time frame, sustainability, or I just put here long term, reversibility / sustainability. Okay, so at this point in the debate, after PM walks through the entire process analysis here, and I would note that properly mechanizing an argument takes the better part of 2 minutes at least, if supplied with characterization, context, and examples. So if you want to develop a new argument, especially like this goes for like second speakers and like maybe member speakers in BP, if you have less than 1 minute left, if the timer hits ping 6 minutes, right? Don't bother trying to develop your last argument or your last extension. You won't have time to sufficiently ground it. It is easy to take down a half-assed or half-baked argument, and it is more effective or more strategic for you to spend time weighing and impacting material that you've already explained at that particular point in your speech. So yeah, mechanism is very important. And obviously, at every step here, if you don't explain certain things, there's a gap in the mechanization. If you're in opposition, you want to directly call those things out. So if this entire section, I'm going to bold it, this entire section didn't exist, and PM directly goes up and says, public shaming means companies lose profit and market share, and that's why they will change their incentives. You notice there's a mechanistic gap as to how that happens. What you want to do on opposition is to directly call out the gap in mechanization and then suggest reasons as to why that might not happen. And obviously, this is not a clash you're going to win. But in the absence of any reasoning as to why something is true, as a judge, you must accept reasons why something is not true, right? So you can suggest why companies have, large financial base are not likely to be incentivized by some people making noise. Why companies, in general, most people in society are just not that woke and are likely to prioritize products that are cheap and accessible. Or why some companies effectively are monopolies. So they control the industry, and calling them out on certain things may make them upset, but may not necessarily create the change that you want to see, right? So that's how you attack the mechanization of things. Anyways, this is how you mechanize the first aspect of creating change. The second part to this argument then is in terms of weighing this change over the counterfactual. So what opposition is going to support is to take the capital that the social movement has, instead of focusing on calling out companies that are doing bad stuff, to instead push on grassroots movements or grassroots awareness campaigns to try to, garner and effect change effectively. Why then is this more likely to happen than that? So if you're a PM, obviously the burden is on op to mechanize how legislation works and all that stuff. But you don't want to point out at PM that op hasn't mechanized because obviously they haven't started speaking yet. What you want to do, especially this applies for all speakers, is to take your opponents at their best, assume that they are going to prove that this outcome happens. Why is the outcome that you have preferable compared to theirs? Right. So in this case, why shaming is preferable compared to legislation. So here's where you can really explain the time frame and just talk about in general. Legislation takes a long time, many stages and process, need to pass, dependent on public support, difficult to get, especially in short term, dependent on passing policy, right? You have conservative politicians try to kill the bill in parliament and stuff. All of which means that even if they're able to successfully achieve legislation, it is still preferable to engage in public shaming if you have to choose one or the other, because you achieve your benefits in a shorter time frame. Achieve change in shorter time frame, right? Protect people who need it right now. Like I think there's one example you can depending on what the context of the motion is, you can talk about how there are certain minorities that face, or the amount of oppression that they face and the amount of social ostracization that they face, the stigmatization they face, is just so great that the absence of any social support structure means that they are likely to do things or engage in things like self-harm, engage in or potentially even push to commit suicide. And these are often things that are irreversible, because obviously once you kill yourself, you can't bring yourself back to life. But all of this means that these people are not protected and have been failed by the movement, right? So urgency to protect people, especially minorities, at greatest risk of self-harm / suicide. The other thing you can say is that trauma, often irreversible, or at least very difficult, hard to reverse, right? So better to proactively prevent harm. then reactively attempt to redress harm. That's, I think, the first thing here. The second thing in terms of time frame is you can weigh the vulnerability of people. Vulnerability, right? So, crap. Don't leave. Oh God, can you guys hear me? Did my internet die?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I thought my internet died. All right, so second thing in terms of vulnerability, you can talk about the people that need help the most. These are people who are directly harmed by corporations, e.g. indigenous people, oil pipeline, and all that stuff, built on their land. They don't really have the capability of fighting for change, right? Don't have capacity to fight for legislative change. No capital to get policy passed. So this move is sort of a direct move that can protect them immediately. Actually, that sort of leads to the second mechanism that I can think of, is in terms of the cost, political costs, right? It is less costly to make a post on Facebook than to go out and campaign for laws to be passed. I think that's relatively intuitive, and then you can just go on to explain why this means that as a movement, especially people that don't have access towards that much capital, you can use this method as a way to achieve some degree of efficacy comparative to no efficacy in the counterfactual. Okay, so the last thing I want to look at in terms of the Gov case is a bit of preemption here, because I think the most obvious benefit of pushing for legislation is the long-term change that is able to effect, and the fact that legislation sort of captures and affects every single person in the country. So what you want to counter this with in terms of long-term / sustainability, you can preempt this by saying that public shaming incurs a degree of cost onto companies, which creates a deterrence factor. Other companies less likely to want to risk being called out. So we're on the side of caution, because every time they get called out, they lose a lot of profit, especially for smaller companies and medium-sized companies that don't really have the luxury of losing profits because they will just die. So you can then say that this does create a degree of long-term change and long-term impact. Obviously, you are not going to win this clash on government, but assuming you can mitigate the long-term effects and just say how even if it's harder to achieve legislation on our side because of the backlash, yada, it's still possible to do so. Given we also have a degree of deterrence, which creates that long-term incentives, we then think that we must prioritize the short-term immediate harm damage towards stakeholders who are being hurt now, as opposed to supporting speculative change in the future. Yeah, I guess that's sort of the third metric. Certainty, or like, actually that's time frame. Yeah, so time frame protect people now, certain, future speculative, don't know whether you get it or not. Okay, so at this point in the debate, does anyone have any questions about the Gov case? If not, so, okay, I didn't expect this to take this long, so I think we'll only have time to prep this one motion. So I'm just going to move down then into prepping the opt case here. So in terms of case setup and case prep, what you do on Gov and opt is probably the same on both sides in terms of identifying what the debate is about and then being able to identify the thesis of the debate or the central question in the round. The next part of the opt case is just sort of mechanizing everything. So opt, what you want to do is to mechanize legislative change. How does it work? How does it achieve outcomes? before moving then into the converse weighing mechanisms as to explaining why you should prefer pushing for legislation over the counterfactual of public shaming. Okay, so how do you achieve and how do you get legislative change? I think what this looks like, firstly, is obviously a lot of awareness campaigns. Grassroots movements. So this looks like slacktivism, sharing woke on Facebook. Okay, everyone wants to be performatively woke. Feels good all around, even though little change happens. But it raises awareness, so that's probably a good thing in the long term. Secondly, it's about lobbying politicians. Actually, this one is also about directly changing behavior, especially so this looks like for the environmental movement, for example, this looks like encouraging people to engage in recycling, e.g. green movement, people to recycle. Lobbying politicians, this looks like Greta Thunberg calling on nations to cut carbon emissions. This looks like feminist movements calling for laws that protect domestic victims of domestic violence. Getting politicians to support those things, getting public figures to endorse those things, and generally creating capital and bringing those things into the public consciousness. Right? So the outcome of this, actually, this should be under max. So the outcome of this is generally a more society that's more aware of problems faced politicians more likely to gain popularity by supporting such policies. This looks like NGOs getting more capital, funds / manpower to research, create, and draft policies. So NGOs and civil society, so things like Amnesty International, like the ACLU in the US, these are NGOs that specifically research the problem, understand the root cause of the problem, and then propose policy solutions as to how those things can be fixed. So that's sort of the internal mechanism there. And then fourthly, and very commonly, donations, right? People donate money to good cause, more capacity to do stuff. Okay, so the flow-on outcome of this then is that it is easier for movements to get legislation passed. Legislation passed through Parliament, enforced everywhere across the board, make it illegal to violate the law. I mean, it's always have to be illegal to violate the law, but make it illegal to do things. To do bad thing because it violates the law. Makes more sense. Okay, so obviously, I think that this is a little bit light on mechanization here. But if you have more context, if you have more examples, you can put inside here to explain how legislative change works. That would be good. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot. The importance of this, or the impact, is legislation passed protects everyone in society, protects people that may not be aware of harms, done protects people that may not have capacity to defend / protect themselves, protects people far into the future, because law passed hard to reverse. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And the last thing is that it's effective because backed up by the monopoly of force that the state uses to coerce behavior. Basically, that's all the reasons why it's impactful. And you have examples to show where the legislation has been passed before and how it was quite effective. That can also be another reason as to why this works. So I looked here at a number of ways that these things happen. I just want to sort of flag an additional mechanism that is a bit controversial, but you can use it as an example. That's judicial activism. So trying to achieve societal change through the courts. So for example, the legalization of gay marriage in the US, the Supreme Court case was Hodges v. Obergefell, if I'm not wrong. And basically what it did was that it set the judicial precedence that the Constitution should be interpreted in this particular way. So it has similar effectiveness when it comes to passing a law, for instance. It's just that it's through the judiciary as opposed to Parliament. But the reason why it's controversial is because that's not supposed to be the job of the judiciary. Like, their job is supposed to interpret the law, they're not supposed to, be progressive activists and stuff. But it can lead to good outcomes. And since the debate sphere is all about that utilitarian bubble, it can be used as a mechanism as well. Okay, the final part of the op case then is in terms of weighing. Why is legislative change preferable to public shaming? So here's where I think that what you can do. So the first thing I would do on opposition is to sort of characterize the costs that public shaming does in terms of backlash. Costs. Right? Creation of backlash. Cost companies would like to be attacked publicly. This is sort of like, if you want to suggest that this harm exists, then you also need to mechanize what this harm looks like. So here's where you explain how public shaming means that corporations are likely to try to undermine the movement. So e.g., this can look like funding research. If you watch the movie Thank You for Smoking, Big Tobacco funded research to dilute link between smoking and lung cancer, which basically made it really difficult for activists to push for the abolishment of cigarette advertisements, especially towards younger children that didn't really understand what was at stake. It can also look like character assassination, e.g., Trump directly attacking Greta Thunberg in public. So the harm here is firstly that it's okay. So in the case of Greta, I would say that the harm is more of the stress inflicted upon the activists and just making their lives a living hell. Right? Make life difficult. But I would also say that attacking the icons or the leaders in the movement can sometimes be incredibly detrimental if those leaders have skeletons in their closets. So a good example for this is ASSK. So supposedly touted as a, pioneer of democracy in Myanmar, a lot of focus was put on her and the controversial decision she made to remain silent on the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, after which the Nobel Peace Prize was stripped But the point here is that it reduced their capacity to push for change in the future. Nobel Peace Prize hurt capacity to fight for change. So especially when there are legitimate things or controversial things that leaders have done, the movements have done before in the past, it makes it harder for them to get things like, yeah, and all that. Second thing is this sort of public alienation. So shaming seen as radical action. So what this means is that the target of shaming makes it like people who are associated with the company. So okay, so for example, if you're an Apple user and Apple has been outed as like supporting slavery in the third world or something like that, or stealing your data, okay, I think that's more realistic. If you're an Apple user and you've invested like, I don't know, 50% of your life savings into Apple products and stuff, it's just not possible for you to just, okay, Apple's a bad company, I need to go and switch to Google and Samsung now. So what this means is that you as a user of Apple sort of makes you complicit in the things that they have done. But the point here is that movements directly shaming these companies indirectly shames the people that use that company's products and services, and people that don't have the capacity for shifting become collateral damage, basically. Collateral damage, people that were responsible, people that had no alternatives, like a whole bunch of reasons why it happens. What this means is that obviously you're going to lose the support of those people because they didn't do anything wrong, yet they're suffering from public shaming. But also, especially when companies and public figures are well liked, it can sometimes be like a double-edged sword. You don't actually get public support on your side, you actually lose public support because people like the person more than they hate the bad thing they've done before in the past. A very good example of this is in the early stages of the hashtag #MeToo movement, outing of certain celebrities and public figures often created worse backlash on the victims. So there was a lot of problems of victim blaming just because people found it difficult to overcome the impression or the counter personality they have about this person. Like, oh, this is such a great person. How could he possibly have done something so bad, and just refuse to believe it? So that's one way that public shaming and public backlash could potentially bounce back on you and like have this double-edged sword. Could bounce back. So the impact of all of this means that it reduces the capacity for movement to achieve change in the future. And here's why you just take government at their best. Assume that public shaming does change the reputational incentives of companies in the short term. This here is why you should not do it, just because there are other things to fight for in the future, and like burning all your capital on this one particular problem is not going to help people in the long term. So here's how you weigh the long term over short term. Yeah. Okay. Means movements lose capacity to push for change in future generations result. Empowered to do accountability max. Obviously, whether these things are true is up for debate, but these are reasons that you can use to say why it's better. Okay, the second metric you can use is what I put up here in terms of sustainability and reversibility. And obviously, for the first part here, as in why these things are costly, comparatively, don't incur backlash. By fighting for legislation, about antagonizing people in power, higher likelihood of success. Yep. Secondly, in terms of sustainability and reversibility, you can then say that streaming short-term solution at best because companies care about reputation, not about reason behind the call out. So either just reverse policy in the future or displace harms elsewhere out of the public eye. e.g., H&M shifting sweatshops from Africa to Vietnam, just displacing harm, not solving problem. And obviously, if you spend all your capital doing this, you have less support to actually fight for proper change in the future. That just means that the change is not sustained. It's just a temporary fix at best. So, better return on investment, push for long-term change, protect more people numerically, future generations. Okay, I hope you are still alive. Anyone have any questions about the case so far? Okay, great. So I hope the workshop was educational. Feel free to steal the case for wherever you may meet this motion in the future, or like variations of this motion and stuff. Yep, so I'll just end it here then. This took a bit longer than expected.